Welcome to this flagship lab case presentation on Chinese standards impacting sustainability in the e-mobility value chain. Our flagship case today focuses on insights gathered from China's approach to sustainability both at the mining stage and through the battery value chain. So, what are our learning objectives from today's presentation? First, it is to have an understanding of non EU approaches to sustainability. How do other countries with different ecological and environmental and economic heritage approach the issue of sustainability? Second, it is to recognize that there are common denominators and there are areas of collaborative development that might exist between China and the EU in these approaches. And finally, for the participants of the flagship lab, think of what issues can you transfer or implement with the EU policy approach to value chains and sustainability. So what is our case context for today? Much like the European Union, China has also committed to reducing its carbon emissions and to achieve carbon neutrality for the entire economy before 2060. In terms of the metals and mining sector, the CNMIA has also drafted an implementation plan that looks at reducing carbon intensity for the industry 5 years earlier than the national target. In addition, there is increased emphasis on recycling and utilization of scrap metal because it is only at this point that China is entering a peak period for metal scrapping. Part of those recycling materials include 4 million tons of copper and 11.5 million tons of aluminium, which are, of course, used within the car manufacturing sector. The case context also considers China's position in the electric vehicle batteries value chain. In 2020, 6 of the top 10 electric vehicle battery makers were from China, and the state has also been pushing for greater utilization and market shares for energy vehicles within the domestic market. And finally, the 5-year plan, which is in place right now, looks at new energy vehicles and one of the strategic new industries. So overall, China's government policy is pushing towards greater use of electric vehicle batteries, both in terms of production and consumption within China. China is using a multi-pronged approach to its sustainability across the value chains. This includes green mining perspectives, traceability, benchmarking performance, improving recycling, and facilitating finance and profitability. In 2010, they initiated the Green Mine Construction Plan. In 2018, they've put forward the Integrated Management Platform for traceability of vehicle electric batteries. In 2021, they looked at recycling and reuse, which includes measurements for reusing electric vehicle batteries. Directives to ensure standards and practices are also profitable for the actors, regulations that benchmark recycling across enterprises, as well as ensuring financial institutions can provide capital to implement this at a large scale. Therefore, there are multiple tools being used to address the same initiative. So let us now consider one of the good practice aspects of this entire sustainability approach, which focuses on green mine construction. Green mining, as with other regions, is defined as efficient extraction, decreasing the environmental footprint, and minimizing waste from the extractive activities. In 2010, China issued green mining construction specifications for metallic, non-metallic, ferrous, gold, coal, and the metallurgical industry. The interesting thing about these specifications, or what we would call as standards in other regions, is that not only do they provide targets to be achieved, they also specify technical specifications. So whether this is tailings dam, whether this is ore to concentrate ratio, whether this is how rehabilitation will take place, what level of greening needs to happen around the mine site, how local communities will be affected, what water usage is acceptable. The standards that were laid down for sustainable mining practices include technical specifications, which we do not find that commonly in standards we are more used to within Europe. You can find a list of these construction specifications at this link. So, what are the key aspects of the green mine construction framework? One of the more interesting elements is the Environmental Evaluation Index. So, the standard itself carries an index for measuring the impact of green mining. Secondly, there are technical standards included within the wider environmental goals that are set under this framework. There is emphasis on technological innovation, both for the mining and smelting practices, and there is a focus on minimizing disturbance, what we normally refer to as mitigating impacts. At the same time, there is emphasis on restoration. So it is not only about mitigating impacts, but restoration of the environment to a state that was existent before the extractive activities took place. So, what does the green mining construction framework look like? There are a number of frameworks, and we've chosen one here which illustrates the thinking behind this standard. It recognizes the drivers that push for mining activity, which is social development, economic growth. It looks at what pressures result from these drivers. And these pressures are environmental in nature, looking at air, water, and ecology. This third step says these pressures, what do they change? They change the way resources are exploited. They change the production technology that occurs there. They look at the mine environment. They look at the economic benefits. And the current status of these things, what impact does it have? It can promote or cause deterioration or improvement in quality of life, on the environmental quality, on social evaluations. So the consideration of the framework follows the drivers, what pressures these create, what is the current status of the resource, and what impacts can they have. Now, these four drivers are then impacted by economic incentives, what management systems are in place, how do policies and regulations impact the status of the sector, and what technological processes and progress can be done to eliminate or reduce impacts. So the thinking is kind of similar to what we see in standards, except this framework brings all of them together in one go. The top half of this diagram is also interesting because it lays down firmly the requirements, not the goals, the requirements of green mining. So green mining needs to have land reclamation. It needs to have community harmony. It needs to have the law enforced properly. There needs to be a culture that thinks about mining. There needs to be energy conservation. So the requirements rather than the end result of green mining is a different way than we're normally used to thinking about standards within our own communities in Europe. At the same time as the requirements, what we find are solutions. And the interesting thing about solutions is the inclusion of technology and scientific planning within the sustainability framework itself. The emphasis on finding technical solutions or enforcing standards that have technology backing them is very clearly stated in the framework for green mining construction in China. One of the elements of the green mine construction framework is this environmental evaluation index, and there are a number of indexes that are being used. The index works on taking the concept of green mining, finding an evaluation framework to measure it, finding indicators that can be used for evaluation that go into the index, and then allowing for an evaluation and conclusion which can benchmark and measure different mining sites and allows for a comparison that is not intuitively there in some of the standards that we consider in Europe. So what do these evaluation index indicators look like? Under drivers, you have indicators for economic growth. Under the pressures on the environment, you have pollutant emissions, you have resource consumption. Under the status of the environment and the production technologies, you again have a list of ratios. You have social impact measurement indicators, and you have responses from the operating entity as to level of science and technology, what is the environmental protection input, green coverage, etc., etc. Now, these environmental evaluation index measurements allow mine by mine comparison or even regional benchmarking, because regardless of the size of the mine or the type of mine, these indicators can be calculated for each mining operation, and then each mining operation can be benchmarked against a different one. This is something we do not see too much of when we talk about sustainability standards in mining in Europe, the ability to benchmark and measure against each other. So, what do these indicators look like? As mentioned in the previous slide, they are either use of ratio of mine water, recovery ratio of ore and concentrate, staff morbidity. A number of different indicators can be adapted depending on which environmental evaluation index you are using. These indicators are then measured and put into an index which looks at environmental protection, comprehensive utilization of resources, community harmony, and enterprise culture, allowing you to track progress over time, as well as tracking progress against other mining operations in a particular region. So, the good practice aspect of the green mine construction so far has been not only laying out what standards and technical specifications should be met, but they're also looking at a measure to allow comparable comparisons. Now, there are challenges as to why China is doing this. Traditionally, mining practices in China have been high resource consumption, very polluting, low efficiency, negative impacts on quality of life. So that was the challenge that they were trying to address. There has been slow progress in this. While the Green Mining Construction Framework was introduced in 2010, by 2019, 1,200 mining companies were identified as green mining projects, which is around 2% of all mines in operation in China. There are issues around implementation as well. Part of the Green Mining Construction Framework puts a lot of emphasis on local governments defining and enforcing these standards, and sometimes there has been inadequate enforcement. There is a high cost of implementation for mining companies because they are moving from traditional mining technologies to new mining technologies, which can be a more expensive proposition. And there is a risk of employing new green technological innovations as these innovations have not been fully tested out. It is important to remember that mining is a mature sector and technology goes through incremental and marginal increases, and there hasn't been a major technological breakthrough at this point. Therefore, the mines in China, as they shift towards new technology, there is a risk of how effective the use of these technologies will be. Let us now move on to a second good practice aspect of the sustainability approach in China, and this has to do with the second use or the ladder approach of electric vehicle batteries. By 2025, the cumulative decommissioning of power batteries in China is expected to be around 780,000 tons. Now, the electric batteries that are currently used in cars, under the 1996 United States Advanced Battery Consortium, the suggestion was that the battery pack should be replaced when it loses 20% of its original capacity. In the EU, this number is more around 30% of original capacity lost. In recent years, as advances have been made, one battery can go further and further, but this standard kind of stands at this point in time. So that means a battery which has 70 or 80% of capacity is no longer used in electric cars. So what happens to that battery? The normal course of events normally leads this to recycling and disassembly. The Chinese approach has been moved from production sales application disassembly to production sales application second use for energy storage. So while these batteries may not be good enough for electric vehicles, they are considered good enough for other use. What do these second life applications consist of? They can be used in electric bicycles, they can be small scale energy storage units, they can be backup power supply for large scale energy storage units, and they can be portable charging devices. And there is a push right now from Chinese policy to not take electric batteries from vehicles directly into the recycling and disassembly stage, but to put them through a second life application before they reach the disassembly and recycling stage. Another good practice aspect of the sustainability approach to electric batteries has been the traceability platform, which was brought in 2008. The traceability platform requires clear provision of data and information on each battery pack, and it utilizes a blockchain technology. The information requires contact details, information on the battery pack from the manufacturer, and that follows through to the disassembler recycling stage. So for example, the car manufacturer needs to put in what kind of battery pack code, what kind it was used in, when was it sold, and the recycler right through the chain needs to sort of specify what was the shipment date, what kind of battery materials were included in, and was it where the battery pack had come from, where it had gone. The importance of traceability is also recognized in the EU, and the battery passport and other traceability platforms are being actively talked about right now. While we cannot speak towards the efficiency of the Chinese traceability platform, the important bit of this information is that they've started something. There is a process in place where you are requiring tracking the battery from point of manufacture to point of recycling, where all different actors can be on the same platform and provide information about the life cycle, the journey of that battery pack. So, what has our flagship case talked about today? We have taken an overall look at how China approaches sustainability in mineral value chains. We talked about the green mining construction framework. We acknowledged that the domestic mining sector in China does not supply the majority of materials required for the electric vehicle battery, but that concept has been brought in to understand how that sustainability approach is being undertaken. And there are two key elements of that sustainability approach for green mining. One, that there is a strong role for technology and science and innovation within it. Two, it leans towards indicators and measurements as part of its specifications. So it's not just ambitions on environmental protection, the standards include targets for how this environmental protection is to be achieved. One of the other aspects that we looked on in the over sustainability approach was this push for secondary use for electric vehicle batteries. Whereas the European approach tends to favor use and then disassembly and recycling, the Chinese policy is pushing for secondary use before those batteries move on to a recycling stage. The third interesting good practice aspect that we talked about was the traceability platform initiated in 2018, allowing and requiring all users to put information into the same platform so it can be tracked as how it goes along. We did discuss the government approach. We have not provided an evaluation of the impact or issues in implementation because the purpose of this flagship case was to generate ideas that we can transfer from the Chinese context. And as China and Europe function on different market mechanisms, the process perhaps is not as important as the goal or the objective that the Chinese policy is trying to achieve. We do also acknowledge that the case, when we talk about sustainability in China, most of it addresses environmental aspects. But that is to be understood because China has one of the largest GHG emissions footprints in the world at the moment. Therefore, its focus is on reducing the environmental impacts of its mining and processing and consumption trends rather than looking at other things. So social and community impacts, perhaps not as greatly detailed as we would see in the European context. The important bit of the transferability of this flagship case is the multi-pronged approach, utilizing different tools to address this issue on multiple fronts. So whereas they're talking about technical specifications, they're also talking about innovation, they're also talking about finance, they're also talking about benchmarking. So all of these things are being pushed around at the same time rather than taking a linear approach. The transferability of the flagship case for a European context is the understanding that while standards are important, the measurement of those standards is also important. And having an index, having a way to compare and offset different operations against each other is an important tool to have. And to not forget the profitability and the finance side of things when addressing the sustainability issue, not just focusing on sustainability indicators, but also looking at how the finance and the profitability of the sector can be maintained while doing these things. So there are some aspects that we can learn from this flagship case. Others perhaps are pertinent only for China, but there is a certain amount of free thinking and finding common denominators between Chinese and European approaches that would be useful for stakeholders in this sector. With that, I thank you for your time and attention, and I hope this has been of interest. And I look forward to speaking to more of you in the Flagship Lab discussion in March. Thank you.